I never thought standing up to my HOA over a bridge to my sister's island would uncover a multi-million-dollar corruption scheme involving politicians, developers, and my nosy neighbors. How was I supposed to know that fighting for my right to visit my cancer-stricken sister would lead to FBI raids and secret recordings that would bring down an entire criminal enterprise? I was tending to my garden when the official HOA letter arrived. Bright yellow paper. Their way of saying this is serious. My hands trembled as I read the words, "Unauthorized structure must be removed within 30 days. They were talking about the wooden footbridge I built last summer, the only direct path to my sister Emily's island home in Lake Pinewood. This can't be happening, I whispered, sinking onto my porch steps. Emily's battle with cancer had gotten worse. That bridge cut a 45-minute drive down to a 3-minute walk. She needed me close by, especially on her bad days after chemo. I immediately called the HOA office, but nobody answered. Of course not. Karen Mitchell only worked when it suited her schedule. I'd have to confront her directly at tomorrow's board meeting. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Without that bridge, how would I get Emily her medications? Her groceries? How would I reach her if she had an emergency? The community center buzzed with whispers when I arrived the next morning. 20 neighbors sat in neat rows of folding chairs while 5 board members perched importantly at a long table up front. Karen Mitchell sat center, her silver-streaked bob perfectly styled, reading glasses dangling from a chain around her neck. Next item, Karen announced, not looking up from her agenda. Enforcement actions for unapproved structures. I raised my hand. I'd like to discuss the violation notice regarding my footbridge. Karen's eyes narrowed. Eleanor Reynolds, 42 Lakeside Drive. Yes, we've documented your unpermitted construction. The bridge violates 3 separate covenants. But it's on my private property, I said, standing up, and it connects to my sister's island, which isn't even part of the HOA's jurisdiction. The shoreline falls under our purview, Karen replied coldly. You failed to submit proper plans for approval. My sister has stage 3 breast cancer, I explained, my voice cracking. That bridge is her lifeline. I take her to treatments, bring her meals. Personal circumstances don't exempt anyone from the rules, Karen interrupted. The board's decision is unanimous. From the corner, Derek Watson nodded smugly. He'd moved in next door 6 months ago and immediately started complaining about everything: my wind chimes, my bird feeder, and now apparently my bridge. Yet somehow his massive boat parked in his driveway never received a citation. I'll appeal, I said firmly. You're welcome to try. Karen's tight smile didn't reach her eyes. But construction on that eyesore stops immediately, and removal begins next week. As the meeting ended, Sophia Lee, a young mom from down the street, touched my arm. This happened to me too, she whispered. They made me tear down my children's playset last month. Said it was too visible from the lake. How can they get away with this? I asked. Karen's husband plays golf with the county commissioner, Sophia explained, and half the board works for Pine Harbor Development. They control everything around here. Walking home, I noticed Derek Watson standing on his deck, photographing my property with a telephoto lens. When he saw me watching, he didn't even pretend to be doing something else. Instead, he smirked and gave a little wave. That afternoon, I called Emily. The HOA is making me take down the bridge. What? Why? Her voice sounded thin, weaker than last week. They claim I didn't get proper permits, but I checked before building it. County said I didn't need any since it doesn't cross public land. This isn't right, Ellie, Emily sighed. Without that bridge. I know. I'll fight it. I promised. Meanwhile, I'll use my kayak to bring your groceries. In winter? That's not safe, Emily protested. Maybe I should just sell this place. Move closer to you. Don't you dare, I said firmly. That island has been in our family for 3 generations. Mom and Dad left it to you because they knew how much you loved it. We'll figure something out. After hanging up, I pulled out my property maps and HOA bylaws. There had to be a loophole somewhere. 3 hours later, I found it. The HOA only controlled construction visible from community property. If I could prove the bridge wasn't visible from any common areas, they couldn't force its removal. I grabbed my camera and headed out, documenting every angle. The bridge was hidden by trees from the community dock, invisible from the main road, and barely noticeable from the water unless you were specifically looking for it. My phone rang as I finished taking photos. An unfamiliar number. "Hello, Ms. Reynolds? This is Martin Green from Pine Harbor Development. I understand you're having some difficulties with your property." My stomach tightened. "How did you get my number?" "Small community," he chuckled. "Listen, I might have a solution that works for everyone. We've been interested in waterfront parcels in your area. If you're open to selling, we could make this HOA problem disappear." "I'm not selling my property," I said flatly. "Think about it," Martin continued smoothly. "We'd offer well above market value. Your sister's place too. Enough for both of you to relocate somewhere more accommodating to your needs." I hung up without answering and immediately called Emily. "Did someone from Pine Harbor just contact you?" "Yes." Emily sounded alarmed. "How did you know?" "They called me too. Something's not right here." That night, I researched Pine Harbor Development. They'd been buying up lakefront properties throughout the county, turning quiet residential areas into luxury condos and resorts. Their latest project had stalled due to one holdout owner who refused to sell. The next morning, a construction crew arrived at my property. A tall man in a hard hat approached with clipboard in hand. "Eleanor Reynolds? We're here to begin removal of the unauthorized structure." "You can't do that," I protested. "I've filed an appeal. The HOA has to review it before any action can be taken." The foreman shrugged. "My orders come directly from the board president. You can take it up with her." I planted myself firmly on the bridge. "I'm not moving. This is private property and you don't have permission to be here." The workers looked uncomfortable. The foreman made a call, speaking in hushed tones before approaching me again. "We'll postpone today's removal," he conceded, "but we'll be back tomorrow with the sheriff if necessary." After they left, I drove straight to the county records office. I needed to understand exactly what rights the HOA actually had over my property. The clerk pulled up my deed and frowned. "That's strange," she mumbled. "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward. "According to this, there's a pending petition to redraw the shoreline boundaries in your area, filed 3 months ago by—" She squinted at the screen. "Pine Harbor Development." My blood ran cold. What would that mean for waterfront properties like mine? If approved, the new boundary would place all shoreline construction under county jurisdiction, which would require permits that weren't previously needed. And those permits would be approved by the County Zoning Commission, she confirmed, chaired by Commissioner Phillips, the same commissioner who played golf with Karen's husband. Driving home, pieces started falling into place. My phone rang Sophia again. "Eleanor, you need to come to my house right now. There's someone here you need to meet." 20 minutes later, I sat in Sophia's living room with 4 other neighbors, all victims of seemingly random HOA violations. Marcus Johnson had been forced to remove his boat dock. Elderly Mrs. Foster faced weekly fines for her non-conforming garden. The Patel family had been denied permission to add a sunroom, yet Karen's identical addition had been approved without issue. "This isn't random," said a man I didn't recognize. "I'm James Wilson, former HOA treasurer. I resigned last year when I noticed irregular payments to a consulting company that doesn't exist." "Why didn't you report it?" I asked. "I tried," James said grimly. "The day after I spoke to a county investigator, my house was broken into. Nothing taken, but my financial records were scattered everywhere. The message was clear." "So what do we do?" Mrs. Foster asked, her hands shaking. "We fight back," I said, surprising myself with my determination. "Together, starting with saving my bridge." As I drove home, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, following too closely. The car stayed behind me turn after turn. My heart pounded as I pulled into my driveway. The vehicle slowed as it passed my house, a black SUV with tinted windows. I couldn't see the driver, but I recognized the Pine Harbor Development logo on the door. Inside my house, I locked every door and window, then peeked through the blinds. Derek Watson stood in his driveway, phone to his ear, watching my home. My phone pinged with a text message from an unknown number. Selling would be easier than fighting. Some battles aren't worth the cost. The early morning darkness was thick as fog as I slipped out my back door. Armed with only a flashlight and my phone camera, I crept toward the bridge. If they planned to destroy it today, I needed evidence of its condition before they arrived. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Are you okay? Couldn't sleep worrying about you." I replied quickly, "I'm fine," documenting the bridge before they come. "Stay put." The wooden planks creaked under my feet as I walked the length of the bridge, filming every detail. The hand-carved railings Dad had taught me to make, the reinforced supports that could withstand lake flooding, the careful design that preserved the natural shoreline. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. No answer, but the beam of my flashlight caught movement in the bushes near my property line. A shadow disappeared into the trees. Rushing home, I locked myself in and called the non-emergency police line. Officer Jenkins arrived 30 minutes later, looking bored as he jotted notes. "Probably just animals, ma'am," he said, yawning. "But we'll keep an eye out during patrols." "This isn't the first strange thing that's happened," I insisted. "Someone's been watching my house, following me." "Any proof?" he asked. "Well, no, but call us if you see something concrete." He handed me his card and left. By sunrise, a different kind of threat appeared. 3 trucks from Lakeside Construction pulling up to my driveway. Karen Mitchell stepped out of her silver Mercedes behind them, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Reynolds," she called out, her voice falsely cheerful. "I hope you've reconsidered your position. The crew is ready to remove the unauthorized structure." I stepped onto my porch, phone recording in my pocket. "I've filed an appeal with documentation proving the bridge doesn't violate any HOA covenants. You can't legally touch it until that appeal is heard." Karen's smile tightened. "The emergency board meeting last night denied your appeal. Notice was posted on the community bulletin board." "At night? That's not proper notification," I countered. "And as a property owner directly affected by the decision, I should have been informed personally." "Rules are rules," Karen said, her patience visibly thinning. "Now please step aside so work can begin." "I have a court order," I lied, gambling that she wouldn't call my bluff. "Any attempt to remove the bridge before the county hearing next week will result in contempt charges." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Show me this order." "My attorney has it. He'll be here within the hour." I stood tall, hoping she couldn't hear my racing heart. "Or you can proceed now and explain to a judge why you ignored due process." The construction foreman shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Mitchell, if there's legal issues, we should probably wait." Karen glared at him, then at me. "Fine. You have until Monday. Then that bridge comes down, court order or not." As the trucks pulled away, my knees nearly buckled with relief. I hadn't expected the bluff to work, but it bought me precious time. My phone rang immediately. "Eleanor? It's James Wilson. Sophia told me what's happening. Meet me at Cedar Creek Coffee in 20 minutes. The small cafe in the next town over was nearly empty. James sat in the back corner, a manila folder in front of him. "I've been gathering evidence since I resigned," he explained, opening the folder. Financial records showing irregular payments, board meeting minutes that were altered, property assessments that magically changed after certain owners refused to sell. I scanned the documents, my coffee growing cold. "This is serious. Fraud at minimum." "It gets worse," James said, lowering his voice. "Pine Harbor isn't just building luxury homes. Their parent company owns stakes in casinos. The lake resort they're planning? That's phase 1. Phase 2 includes a private entertainment venue that conveniently sidesteps gambling restrictions on county land. How is that even possible? State Senator Williams introduced a bill last year creating a loophole for hospitality entertainment zones. Pine Harbor's CEO donated heavily to his campaign. I sat back, stunned. So my little bridge is standing in the way of a multi-million-dollar casino development? Your property and your sister's island are the missing pieces they need, James confirmed. Without them, they can't create the continuous shoreline their plans require. No wonder they're so desperate, I murmured. But why not just offer more money? Everyone has a price. James smiled sadly. They tried that first, didn't they? But people like you and your sister, people with roots and principles, you're their worst nightmare. Driving home, I called Emily. We need to meet. Not on the phone. Can you come over tonight? I have chemo today, she reminded me. I'll be too sick. Then I'll come to you. And Em, don't talk to anyone about your property. No one. Getting to Emily's island without the bridge meant taking my kayak. I packed waterproof bags with documents, a fresh sweater for Emily, and her favorite soup. As I dragged my kayak to the water's edge, a familiar black SUV cruised slowly past my house. This time, I clearly saw Derek Watson in the passenger seat. The lake was choppy, making the journey difficult. By the time I reached Emily's dock, my arms ached and I was soaked from splashing waves. But seeing my sister's pale face at the window made every stroke worth it. You shouldn't have come in this weather, she scolded, helping me inside. We've got trouble, I said, unpacking the documents. Bigger than we realized. Emily listened as I explained what James had told me. Her face grew more concerned with each detail. So that's why they've been calling me daily, she said. A man named Greg Taylor keeps upping his offer for the island. Yesterday he mentioned my medical bills. Like he knew exactly how much they were. A chill ran through me. Have you told anyone about your finances? Just my insurance and the hospital, Emily said. And you, of course. I thought of Derek watching my house, the mysterious text messages, the feeling of being followed. They're monitoring us somehow. We spent hours reviewing our options. Selling wasn't one of them. This land had been in our family for generations. Fighting the HOA alone seemed impossible given their connections, but going public might work. Local news loves David versus Goliath stories, I suggested, especially when cancer patients are being harassed by developers. Emily looked uncertain. That's a big step, Ellie. These people obviously have power. So do we, I insisted. Truth is power. Community is power. As night fell, I reluctantly prepared to leave. The lake would be dangerous in darkness, but I needed to get home. Stay, Emily urged. It's not safe. I can't, I replied. If I'm not home when they come tomorrow, they might start demolition anyway. Halfway across the lake, my kayak light illuminated something in the water ahead. Floating debris. As I paddled closer, my blood ran cold. Wooden planks. Railing posts. My bridge. They'd already begun destroying it. I paddled frantically toward my property. From the water, I could see flashlights moving along my shoreline. The sound of power tools echoed across the lake. Pulling my phone from its waterproof case, I called 911. There are people trespassing on my property, destroying my bridge without permission, I reported, trying to keep my voice steady. We'll send someone right away, the dispatcher promised. I stayed in my kayak, hidden by darkness, watching as 3 figures worked quickly to dismantle what remained of the bridge. One of them was definitely Derek. The others I couldn't identify in the darkness. 20 excruciating minutes later, police lights flashed at the end of my driveway. The trespassers immediately scattered, disappearing into the woods between our properties. Officer Jenkins, the same one from this morning, spoke with me as I finally reached shore. You're sure they didn't have permission? He asked skeptically. Of course I'm sure, I exclaimed. It's my bridge on my property. Well, according to HOA records, they scheduled this removal with your consent, Jenkins said, checking his notes. Signed documentation and everything. My blood boiled. They forged my signature? That's illegal. That's a serious accusation, ma'am, Jenkins replied stiffly. Do you have proof? In that moment, I realized how deep this conspiracy ran. Police, HOA, developers, all working together. Not yet, I admitted. But I will. After Officer Jenkins left, I surveyed the damage. The bridge was halfway dismantled, unsafe to cross. Getting to Emily would now require the kayak or a 45-minute drive around the lake. Inside my house, I collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion and despair washing over me. Then my eyes caught something on my coffee table that hadn't been there before. A business card for Pine Harbor Development with a handwritten note. Final offer, $750,000 for your property. $1.2 million for your sister's island. This offer expires tomorrow. Someone had been inside my house. With shaking hands, I started checking rooms, closets, under beds. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the violation of my space left me trembling. I called James. They broke into my house? I whispered, afraid of being overheard. Get out of there, he said immediately. Come to my place. Bring whatever evidence you have. I can't leave, I argued. If I go, they win. If you stay, you might get hurt, James countered. This isn't just about a bridge anymore, Eleanor. As if to punctuate his warning, my lights suddenly went out, plunging the house into darkness. Through my window, I could see the rest of the neighborhood still had power. My phone pinged with a new text message. Last chance to accept our offer. Things get complicated after tonight. I grabbed my emergency flashlight, documents, and laptop, then slipped out my back door. I wouldn't stay where they could find me, but I wouldn't run away either. Instead, I headed for Sophia's house. Together, we would build a case stronger than any bridge. As I crept through backyards to avoid being seen from the street, a new determination filled me. They'd destroyed my bridge to my sister, but in doing so, they'd built something else. A bridge between neighbors who'd had enough of being bullied. And that connection might be strong enough to bring down the entire corrupt system. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as my boat bounced over choppy waves. Without my bridge, this 40-minute trip around the peninsula had become my daily routine to reach Emily. The boat sputtered and I smacked the dashboard. Not today, I muttered. I couldn't afford repairs. Not after the $750 fine Karen had slapped me with for improper bridge removal procedures. Finally reaching Emily's dock, I found her sitting in her garden, paler than yesterday. Her favorite blue cardigan hung loose around her shoulders. You won't believe what happened at my doctor's appointment, Emily said, trying to sound upbeat. Dr. Patel says I'm responding to the new treatment. I hugged her gently, hiding my worry. That's amazing news. I brought your groceries and mail. While Emily rested, I sorted her medications into the weekly pill organizer. My hands shook from exhaustion. 3 hours of sleep wasn't enough, but I couldn't let her see my struggle. Stop pretending you're okay, Emily called from the doorway, startling me. You look worse than I do, and I'm the one with cancer. I sighed. I've been digging into something strange. Remember how the HOA suddenly raised fees last year for infrastructure improvements, but nothing changed? Emily nodded, sitting across from me at her kitchen table. Look at this, I said, opening my laptop. I requested public records for all HOA vendors. This company, Green Valley Landscaping, received $487,000 over 3 years. Emily squinted at the screen. For what? Planting a few flowers? Exactly. And guess who owns it? I pulled up a business registration. Thomas Mitchell, Karen's brother-in-law. Emily's eyes widened. You think they're stealing money? It gets worse. I showed her property records I downloaded. The HOA has been buying up foreclosed homes through a shell company. 6 houses in 2 years. And look who's been triggering the foreclosures. Derek Watson? Emily whispered, recognizing our neighbor's name. He works for a mortgage servicing company. Every foreclosed home was processed through them, with tiny paperwork errors that the homeowners couldn't fight. Thunder rumbled outside as rain began pelting the windows. I needed to head back before the storm worsened. Be careful with this information, Emily warned, walking me to the door. These people sound dangerous. I hugged her goodbye. I'll be fine. I'm meeting with Sophia and Marcus tonight to figure out our next step. The rain had turned into a downpour by the time I docked at the marina. Soaked and shivering, I jogged to my car, not noticing the black SUV parked nearby. Opening my front door, I immediately sensed something wrong. My security system light flashed red instead of green. Inside, drawers hung open, papers littered the floor. My desktop computer was gone. Heart pounding, I backed toward the door, but froze when I saw the kitchen counter. A single piece of paper sat there, an official HOA violation notice with today's date. Unauthorized investigation of board activities. $2,500 fine. My phone rang, making me jump. Sophia's voice came through, trembling with panic. Marcus just called me from his car. 2 men showed up at his house with an eviction notice. They changed the locks while he was at work. That's impossible, I said, checking that my doors were locked. He pays through automatic bank transfers. They said his last 6 payments were improperly processed. He has 3 days to vacate. I peered through my blinds at the empty street. This is retaliation. They know we're onto them. There's something else, Sophia whispered. I followed Derek yesterday. He had lunch with someone from Pine Harbor Development. I took photos. I grabbed my emergency bag from the closet. Send them to me. I'll come to your. You don't understand, Sophia interrupted. I heard them talking about building permits for a resort. They specifically mentioned Emily's Island as the final piece. They need her property, Ellie. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The bridge demolition, the harassment, everything was about isolating Emily to pressure her into selling. I'm calling Emily right now, I said, dialing with shaking fingers. No answer. My doorbell rang, making me nearly drop the phone. Through the peephole, I saw 2 men in dark suits, standing stiffly under umbrellas. One held up a badge that glinted in my porch light. Ms. Eleanor Reynolds? Called a deep voice. FBI. We'd like to ask you some questions about Lakeside Community HOA. My breath caught in my throat. Had Karen reported me? Or was something bigger happening? Please, sit down, Ms. Reynolds, said the taller FBI agent, flashing his badge. I'm Special Agent Torres. This is Agent Michaels. My living room felt like a trap. Were they really FBI? Or working for Karen? We've been investigating Lakeside Community HOA for 8 months. Torres continued, pulling out a folder. Money laundering, wire fraud, racketeering. My mouth fell open. You're not here to arrest me? Agent Michaels almost smiled. No, your bridge complaint actually helped us. You've been documenting things we couldn't access without warrants. Relief flooded through me until Torres added. But our surveillance indicates Karen Mitchell was tipped off about our investigation this morning. My blood ran cold. My sister is alone on her island. We have agents heading there now, Torres assured me, but I was already grabbing my keys. Emily's not answering her phone, I said, rushing toward the door. I need to get to her. The agents followed me to my car. We'll drive, Michaels insisted. Rain lashed against the windshield as we sped toward the marina. Lightning illuminated the angry waves of the lake. Tell us everything you know, Torres said as we drove. I explained about the bridge, the mysterious foreclosures, and the resort plans. They need Emily's Island to complete their development. Without it, they can't build the resort. At the marina, we discovered my boat's fuel line had been cut. This wasn't an accident, Michael said, examining the clean slice. Torres spoke urgently into his radio. Teams approaching from the North Shore need to expedite. We have evidence of immediate threat. I spotted my neighbor's kayak tied at the dock. I'm not waiting, I announced, already untying it. Ms. Reynolds, that's too dangerous in this storm, Torres called. But I was already pushing off into the churning water. Follow by road, I shouted back. There's a longer route around the peninsula. The kayak bounced wildly on the waves as rain pelted my face. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the distant shape of Emily's Island. My arms burned with each paddle stroke, but fear drove me forward. Approaching Emily's dock, I spotted two unfamiliar black SUVs parked near her house. Lights glowed from inside, and shadows moved across the windows. I tied the kayak underneath the dock instead of on top, then crept through the wet underbrush toward the back of the house. Voices drifted through an open window. "The treatment center in Switzerland is the best in the world," a man's voice said smoothly. "All expenses paid, Ms. Reynolds. Just sign the papers." "I told you." Emily's voice sounded weaker than this morning. "I'm not selling my home. Your condition requires specialized care." Another voice, Derek's, chimed in. "Care you can't afford without our help." Peering through the kitchen window, I saw Emily backed against the counter. Derek Watson stood blocking one doorway, while a man in an expensive gray suit held papers in front of her. "My sister will be here soon," Emily said, her chin raised defiantly despite her paleness. The suited man laughed. "Your sister is currently occupied with the FBI. A misunderstanding we arranged." My wet clothes clung to my skin as I tried the back door. Locked. I grabbed a heavy flower pot from Emily's garden. The crash of breaking glass made everyone inside freeze. I climbed through the shattered window, cutting my hand but barely feeling it. "Actually, I'm right here," I announced, stepping into the kitchen. "And now I understand exactly why you were so desperate to tear down my bridge." Derek spun around, his face twisting with rage. "You should have minded your own business, Eleanor." Emily moved toward me, her eyes wide with relief and fear. "Step away from my sister," I demanded, positioning myself between Emily and the men. "Ms. Reynolds." The suited man adjusted his tie, unruffled. "I'm James Wilson, Chief Development Officer for Pine Harbor Resort. We're offering your sister a very generous package." "You mean you're trying to bully a cancer patient?" I replied, "after isolating her by destroying her only easy access to help." "Business is business," Wilson shrugged. "This island is the centerpiece of our new resort. Every other property owner has signed." "Because you forced foreclosures through Derek's company?" I countered, watching Derek's face pale. "You have no proof of anything," Derek snapped, but his eyes darted nervously to Wilson. "Actually, I have copies of everything," I bluffed, "including recordings of your lunch meeting yesterday discussing the resort plans." Wilson's smooth demeanor cracked. "Where are these supposed records?" "Safe with people who will release them if anything happens to us." Emily spoke up, her voice stronger now. Derek stepped toward us menacingly. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Why don't you tell me?" I challenged, grabbing a kitchen knife from the counter behind me. Wilson's smile turned cold. "Pine Harbor Development doesn't take no for an answer, and neither does Senator Collins." My mind raced. Senator James Collins, the state senator pushing controversial waterfront development laws that weakened environmental protections. "So the senator is involved in your scheme?" I asked, stalling for time. The FBI agents had to be on their way. "James, shut up," Derek hissed. "It doesn't matter now," Wilson waved dismissively. "Once we have this property, the project proceeds regardless of what they know." Derek grabbed Emily's arm roughly. "Just sign the damn papers." I lunged forward with the knife, not aiming to hurt but to threaten. "Take your hands off her." Suddenly, bright blue lights flashed through the windows. A voice boomed through a megaphone. "FBI! The house is surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Wilson's face drained of color. Derek released Emily's arm like it had burned him. "You led them here," Derek snarled at me. "No," I replied calmly. "Your own greed did that." My phone buzzed at 5 a.m. with a text from Agent Torres. "Turn on your TV now." I fumbled for the remote, and there it was, Karen Mitchell in handcuffs, being led from her pristine colonial home while neighbors watched in bathrobes. The news anchor's voice filled my quiet living room. "Breaking. FBI raids homes of Pinecrest Harbor HOA board members in massive fraud investigation." I sat stunned, coffee forgotten in my hand. This wasn't just about my bridge anymore. By noon, my doorbell wouldn't stop ringing, reporters, neighbors, even people I barely knew asking what I knew. I didn't answer. Instead, I drove straight to the FBI field office where Agent Torres had asked me to bring all my documentation. "You've given us the missing pieces," she said, spreading photos across a metal table. "Look familiar?" The images showed Karen and her husband meeting with developers at exclusive restaurants, exchanging envelopes, reviewing maps of Emily's Island. In one, Senator Collins himself stood pointing at what looked like architectural plans. "We've been tracking the money for months," Torres explained. "Over $4 million moved through shell companies owned by HOA board members. Your neighbor Derek? He's actually a former real estate attorney who lost his license for fraud in another state." My stomach dropped. But how did they think they'd get away with stealing Emily's land? They nearly did. The plan was elegant: use HOA violations to isolate your sister, cut off her support system, then pressure her to sell while she was vulnerable. The bridge was just the first step. I thought of Emily alone on her island, fighting cancer while these vultures circled. My hands shook with anger. "We need you to do something difficult," Torres said, sliding a small recording device across the table. "The community meeting tonight. We need Karen to incriminate herself publicly." "You want me to be bait?" I said flatly. Torres nodded. "We need to show the community was victimized, not just your family." That evening, I walked into the emergency HOA meeting with the wire taped to my ribs, heart hammering. The community center buzzed with angry voices. Sophia squeezed my hand as I passed, a silent gesture of support. Karen stood at the podium, somehow still maintaining her composure despite the morning's raids. "These accusations are completely unfounded," she announced to the packed room. "The board has always acted in the community's best interests." I waited until she finished her practice speech before standing. "Is that why you demolished my bridge to isolate my sister while developers pressured her to sell her island?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile tightened. "Your unauthorized structure violated clear bylaws, Eleanor. This has nothing to do with your sister's property." "Then explain these," I said, as Sophia distributed copies of documents to stunned residents, property assessments showing Emily's Island undervalued by millions, fake environmental reports claiming contamination, and bank records showing payments to board members from Pine Harbor Development. Karen's husband jumped up. "Where did you get those?" "That's confidential information." "Actually," called Marcus from the back, "they're public records once they're evidence in a federal investigation." Karen's perfect mask cracked. "You ungrateful people. Do you have any idea what that resort would have done for property values? We were all going to benefit by forcing out my dying sister." I stepped closer to the podium. "By changing zoning laws behind closed doors? Your sister was offered fair compensation." Karen snapped, her voice rising. "If she wasn't so stubborn." "So you admit the bridge removal was connected to the development plans?" I pressed. The room fell silent. Karen realized her mistake too late. Her eyes darted to her husband, who was already backing toward the exit. "Senator Collins promised us protection," she blurted, desperate now. "He said no one would look too closely if we handled the problems quietly." The double doors at the back of the room swung open. Senator Collins himself walked in, flanked by FBI agents. "I don't believe I promised any such thing, Karen." Her face went ash white. "James, tell them. You approved everything." The senator straightened his tie. "I'm afraid Mrs. Mitchell has been under tremendous pressure. I'm here to announce my office's full cooperation with this investigation." As agents moved to detain Karen and other board members, I noticed Derek slipping out a side door. Would he escape while the others took the fall? And what would happen to Emily's Island now that the truth was coming to light? "Not guilty," Karen's lawyer announced to reporters on the courthouse steps while I watched on my phone screen, grip tightening until my knuckles turned white. How could this happen? "The case isn't over," Agent Torres assured me over the phone. "The judge only dismissed 2 counts. Fraud and conspiracy charges are still moving forward." But I felt defeated. 3 months of legal battles had drained my savings and energy. Emily's health had worsened from the stress, and Derek Watson had vanished without a trace. likely somewhere tropical with no extradition. They're coming after your land next, Sophia warned that evening, bringing dinner she'd cooked for Emily and me. Karen's husband filed countersuits claiming emotional distress and defamation. Let them try, I said, though fear knotted my stomach. I couldn't afford more legal fees. The kitchen table disappeared under threatening letters from expensive law firms. That night I couldn't sleep. Standing at my window, I stared across the water at Emily's dark house. Without the bridge, I'd have to wait until morning to check on her. What if she needed me? A flicker of movement caught my eye, a flashlight beam sweeping across Emily's porch. Someone was there. I called 911 while rushing to the dock, throwing my small boat into the water without thinking. The motor sputtered in the cold night air as I raced across the dark water, panic rising. Halfway across, headlights appeared on the peninsula road, police responding to my call. But they were taking the long route. I'd reach Emily first. I cut the motor early, drifting silently to her dock. The beam of light now moved inside the house. Grabbing a boat oar, I crept up the path. The back door stood open. Inside, I heard drawers being emptied, papers shuffling. I raised the oar, heart pounding, and stepped into the kitchen. Freeze! I shouted at the hunched figure rifling through Emily's desk. The flashlight swung toward me, momentarily blinding me. Eleanor. That voice. Not an intruder, it was Marcus Johnson. What are you doing here? I lowered the oar, confused. He held up a thumb drive. Finding our salvation. Emily called me, said she remembered something important. Blue lights flashed outside as police arrived. Marcus quickly explained. Emily kept backups of everything. She has video of Derek and Senator Collins discussing how they faked environmental reports to force the sale of her island. The evidence changed everything. Within weeks, the senator's protection crumbled as he faced his own indictment. Karen's remaining defenses collapsed when her financial records were subpoenaed, revealing offshore accounts filled with development money. But the biggest surprise came from Mrs. Foster, our elderly neighbor who'd been keeping meticulous records of every HOA meeting for 12 years. Her detailed notes provided the timeline prosecutors needed, showing how the scheme had evolved from simple corruption to organized fraud. I always knew that woman was trouble, Mrs. Foster said when I thanked her. Started with her giving citations for my bird feeders while ignoring her friend's violations. At the final court hearing, I sat with Emily, now using a wheelchair but determined to face Karen herself. The judge's words rang through the hushed courtroom. This court sentences Karen Mitchell to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and misappropriation of funds. Karen refused to look at us as she was led away, her designer suit replaced by prison-issued clothes. 6 months later, we gathered on a perfect spring day to celebrate. Not just Emily's cancer remission, but the completion of a new, wider bridge connecting our properties, built with funds from the HOA restitution settlement. Should we cut the ribbon? Sophia asked, champagne in hand, surrounded by neighbors who'd stood with us through everything. Emily shook her head, smiling. No need for ceremony. This bridge isn't just for me and Eleanor anymore. It's for everyone. And she was right. The settlement had transformed our community. The new HOA board, led by Marcus and Mrs. Foster, had rewritten the bylaws to focus on actual community needs rather than petty rules and power games. Children now played freely across properties without fear of citations. Residents exchanged plants from gardens that once would have violated approved species lists. Emily's Island, once coveted by developers for its natural harbor, had been placed in a conservation trust, protecting it forever. You know what I learned from all this? Emily said as we walked together across the bridge, her strength returning more each day. Sometimes the thing someone tries hardest to take from you becomes the very thing that saves you. I watched a family picnicking on the shoreline below, new residents in what had been Derek's house. Their laughter drifted up on the breeze. Do you ever regret standing up to them? Marcus asked, joining us midspan. Knowing what it would cost? I looked at my sister, at our community reborn, at the bridge that connected us all. Some victories aren't measured in courtrooms or settlements, but in the simple freedom to walk across water to help someone you love. Not for a single moment, I answered, and knew it was absolutely true.